Chainsaw that doesn't run out of gas. Time machine. Oh, hey there, my Yuletide terror hounds. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. One of the biggest holidays is just around the corner, and it's easy to get greedy, but that green-eyed monster may just be staring right back at you. So, relive the past with some hot cocoa, enjoy the present by a warm fireside, and prepare for a fearful future with Doughboy420's A Dark Christmas Carol.
I had been working on my paperwork all day. It was the busy season, and one of the busiest days of the season. Running all the operations of a multi-million-dollar company like Red Mart is no easy task. I have to keep track of all sorts of things. The sales, the shipping costs, the wages of my employees. If I could have gotten away with paying them the bare minimum, I would have. But there are laws in place to prevent such a thing. With all the employees I had to pay, the company was barely making a profit. As far as I seen it, these people were taking money from my pockets. Profits were down, and we were barely making bank. I had to do something. I couldn't pay them any less, so perhaps I could lay them off. Yes, that would raise the profits of Red Mart. I gathered together a group of names that I felt no longer mattered in my store. Nothing personal against them. I just had to do what was best for business. If you want to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs, right? At the day's end is when the group was regretfully informed that their services would no longer be required, and that we wished them the best in their future endeavors. The usual shit to keep from hurting people's feelings. They would be okay, though. A few of them would be able to collect unemployment and leech off the government. At least they wouldn't be leeching off of me. Most of them took it all right and left without saying a word, but one man decided to come speak to me personally in my office. The man did not have an appointment with me, so he had no right barging into my office and harassing me. Robert Cratchit was his name. I only knew that because he was polite enough to introduce himself before spouting off at me about the economy and his family issues. The man was nearly bawling like a baby. How pitiful. He didn't need my money. He could go collect welfare or something. Put his hands in someone else's pockets, but not mine. No, not mine. I called security and had the man escorted off the premises. He went without much of a fuss, thankfully. I couldn't have him disturbing the customers. I was trying to run a business, after all.
"Merry Christmas, Edward Scrooge,"
he said, nearly sobbing as the guards walked him out of my office. Merry Christmas? I said to myself. Bah! I continued. What is Christmas but a time for consumerism? Mothers buying toys and games for their brat children, children screaming and crying for more. Capitalism at its finest. This season made me money, but it also made me sick. People going door to door, singing carols and disturbing my peace. Christmas lights shining through my windows at night. Humbug, I said, before returning to the work at hand. Day turned into night. A very cold night. The sky was blanketing everything with a thick layer of snow, and the roads were very bad. But luckily for me, I had a new Humvee and didn't need to worry about the poor road conditions. So, no worries at all. It took me a bit longer than usual to get home. It was mostly due to getting stuck in some traffic due to an accident. Surely due to incompetence, I thought, as I approached the scene. It was a red sedan that had lost control and overturned. The driver was probably going too fast, and the car was obviously old and in poor shape. It probably shouldn't have been on the road to begin with. Out here, you have to have four-wheel drive, or you aren't going anywhere. They should have gotten a four-wheel drive car. What are they thinking? I asked myself as I drove past them and continued onward to my home. I lived alone in a 3-story, old Victorian mansion. I fell in love with the place when I had moved to this neck of the woods with my friend Jonathan. I knew right then and there that I had to have it, and being the newly appointed co-owner of Red Mart, I knew I could afford it. So, I bought it. All thanks to my friend John and his dad. Yes, John. I began to reminisce about my good friend as I pulled into my driveway and approached my home. Jonathan Marley was a friend of mine since childhood. We used to get in all kinds of trouble together. His father, Red Marley, was the founder of Red Mart. My father had left my mother and I high and dry when I was a baby. So Red became kind of that father figure to me, and he taught John and I everything we knew. He knew what was best for business. He turned Red Mart into what it is today, and I would be damned if I would let his legacy go down the toilet. I'd be damned if I let John's legacy go down the toilet. 10 years, I thought. It's been 10 years since you left, Johnny. I continued as I climbed out of my Humvee and made the trek through the snow up to my door. The wind was cold that night, and it pierced right through my core and chilled me to my bones. By the time I was at the front door, I was already shivering. My hands shivered and shook as I reached for the keys in my pocket. I fumbled through them with numb fingers. Car key, truck key, gardening shed. Ah, the house key, I said, as I found the right key and looked up to my door to insert the key into the lock. But what I seen there disturbed me and startled me, causing me to drop the keys. I looked down to where my keys had fallen, and then looked back up, and all was normal again. I swear on my life that I had seen my friend's face, there within the iron knocker upon my door. There I seen his face, twisted and mangled within the metal knocker upon my door. My friend Jonathan Marley's face, his pleading face upon my door. And as quickly as the apparition came, it had vanished, leaving me in the cold once more. I thought I was imagining things. It was cold, and I hadn't had anything to eat or drink for a while. Perhaps I was just tired. Yes, that's it. I was just tired. I slid the key into the lock and entered the door, preparing for the cold night ahead of me. After having my dinner, I settled down to read a good book by the fireplace. I had no television, like most people in today's society. I had no use for such a thing. I didn't like dealing with the whining populace at my job, so why would I want to come home and watch more of them? I sat there, flipping through the pages of my book for a good half an hour, when the lights in my house began to flicker. Oh no, I said. I'm going to have to start the generator if the electricity goes out, I told myself. It was shortly after that my fears became a reality. The lights flickered again, and then cut completely out. The storm had knocked out the power, leaving me in the darkness, in the silence of the night. The only light that remained was that which was emanating from a burning fire in my fireplace. Bah, I said as I climbed slowly to my feet. Surely those terrible drivers again, I thought, as I threw on my coat. Now I've got to go outside, in the cold, and turn on my generator. Ah, I said to myself as I walked toward the front door. Then I heard it. First, it was like a whisper, but then, as I approached the door, the sound got louder. Eddie. A voice spoke my name. Eddie. The voice seemed familiar. It sounded like my friend John. Edward. The voice continued. It was muffled behind the door, but it was clear enough to tell what was said. Johnny? I said as I opened the door. Johnny, is that you? I swung the door open. Nothing. Nothing was there. Just the snow falling down from the cold, dark sky. I looked around, confused. I knew I had heard something. I knew I had heard someone calling my name. I was sure someone was outside my door. There was no way someone could have been playing a prank on me. There were no footsteps in the snow. There was no way anyone could have been there. But then how did I hear someone calling my name? Who did I hear? What did I hear? Another sound startled me. It was the sound of metal clanging together, like chains clashing against the floor. I stood there, frozen in fear. I didn't want to turn to see what ghastly thing stalked me. Scrooge! A haunting and familiar voice moaned from over my shoulder. I turned to see who it was that spoke my name. I was shocked when I seen the familiar face of my friend, John Marley. He looked pale and white, just as he did the day he was put into the ground. He was in the same three-piece suit that he'd been buried in. But there was more. Behind Marley, there was a long trail of thick and heavy chains. The chains connected to large safes and lockboxes, and then trailed along and on upward to shackles about Jonathan's wrists and ankles. Large chains were crisscrossed over him and padlocked into place about his shoulders and his waist. He was obviously in pain, having to bear the weight of those iron chains. Johnny? I asked. Is that you? I questioned further. Edward. The phantom spoke, and as he spoke, a trail of black mucus fell from his lips and splattered onto the ground. However, as soon as the disgusting liquid hit the tile of my floor, it evaporated into a thick black mist and dispersed into the air. Johnny, my friend, what has become of you? I asked. Your chains will be twice as long, you know. The apparition spoke to me. What do you mean? I asked, confused by the statement. Your chains will be twice as long, and the locks upon them twice as thick. The spirit spoke as more viscous liquid seeped out from the corners of his mouth and splashed down onto the floor, only to evaporate in a smoky mist that filled the air. What are you talking about? I asked, still confused. Edward Scrooge, you put a profit before all else. You will bear the weight of every dime you have hoarded over the years, every cent, every quarter, nickel, and penny that you gained from profiting off of others will be carried with you. John spoke. Bah! Why do you tell me these lies, spirit? I do only what is best for business. I blurted back at John. Your greed, Scrooge. Your greed will be your undoing. Your greed will bring you a fate worse than mine. Jonathan continued. Nonsense. Humbug. Why do you say these things, John? You are my best friend. Why do you insult me? I asked. I'm here to help you, Eddie. The phantom spoke. Tonight, You will be visited by 3 spirits. Tonight, you will see where you went astray. Expect the first spirit when the clock strikes 1. Marley told me. Jonathan began to choke and gargle up more of that black goo, the same goo that turned into a mist when it had touched the floor. Then he gasped and looked over his shoulder and then back at me. He had a look of fear upon his face. He appeared to be terrified of something behind him, something I could not see, something that existed within his world. Remember, Scrooge, expect the first ghost when the clock strikes 1. Jonathan Marley repeated before the chains lifted off the floor behind him and tightened around his chest. Then, with one last pleading look at me, Marley was sucked backwards into nothingness. He disappeared into thin air. He was pulled backward and vanished into nothing. Where did he go? But more importantly, what pulled him back into that ethereal world from whence he came? I stood there, stunned for a while, my door still wide open, letting in the cold and the snow soaking my floor. I was in a daze, amazed by what I had seen, and I was so shocked by what I had seen that I didn't snap out of it until I felt the melting snow against my heels. I turned and shut the door, still in awe of the events that had just happened. I returned to my living room and extinguished the fire in my fireplace before I made my way upstairs to bed. I was in shock, but I couldn't have seen a ghost. I don't believe in ghosts. That's just a bunch of hogwash, a bunch of scary nonsense that they use to scare children into submission. I must have been hallucinating. Did I bump my head? I asked myself. No, perhaps I actually need sleep more than I thought I did. I told myself as I donned my long johns and climbed into my king-size bed. My bed was brand new and very comfortable. However, the frame it laid upon was very, very old. It was an antique frame and with an overly carved, ornate wooden post at each corner. It was an antique frame with an ornately carved wooden post at each corner, all capped with an ornate frame atop the posts, where a red curtain hung tied to each post with a golden rope. I could let the curtain down and block out all the light from those damn Christmas lights that flickered outside my window. My nearest neighbors were a good distance away, but they also went all out on Christmas, and I could see their house clearly from my bedroom window. They found it cute. I found it annoying. After pulling those curtains closed, I drifted off to sleep, paying no mind to the warning I had received from my hallucination of Marley. I awoke to hear the bell of the antique grandfather clock that stood in the hallway outside of my bedroom door. It was 1 o'clock. I sat up in bed, remembering the warning that Jonathan had given me. I sat there for a moment, and nothing happened. Ah, spirits. I don't believe in ghosts. I was obviously just tired, I said, as I laid back in bed.
Hello, Mrs. Scrooge.
An innocent, childlike voice spoke from my right. I rolled over immediately to see the face of a little girl sitting on the bed beside me. I jumped out of bed and fell to the floor with a painful thud. Scrambling away from the bed, I glanced over my shoulder and then rolled over when I got to the wall. I was cornered, stuck between the wall and the bed, between a rock and a hard place. The door was on the other side of the bed. The child crawled across the bed and climbed down onto the floor. Her movements seemed kind of mechanical. She didn't move fluidly. Her limbs would jerk and twitch as she moved. She wore a white dress with a matching bow in her hair, and she appeared innocent yet otherworldly, menacing with an ethereal glow about her. She stepped across the floor toward me. Her body seemed to twitch as she moved. "Stop!" I screamed at the ghost. She did as I asked. She stood there hauntingly before tilting her head to the side and staring at me. "Why are you here?" I asked. "What have I done to you?" I continued.
You didn't do anything, Mr. Scrooge.
The child said sweetly, her head twitching back upright.
I am the ghost of Christmas past, and I'm here to show you where you went wrong.
She continued, her voice sounding innocent yet menacing. What are you talking about?" I asked, terrified and confused.
Come with me.
She said, quietly. I'm sorry, but I think I'm gonna stay here. I have to get some rest after all," I pleaded with the spirit. The spirit then leaned down toward me, her body twitching again as she bent forward. Her eyes were a bright gray-blue color, and then I watched them as they clouded over with a black mist. The mist in her eyes thickened until they were completely black. Her eyes were so black they appeared to be empty sockets.
Come with me.
She said again, this time with a more stern tone, as she held out her hand to me. "Oh, okay," I said, as I reluctantly reached up, with a hand that shook almost as badly as hers, and gripped her outstretched hand. As I gripped the shaking child's hand, I was pulled upward and quickly out of the window of my room. I didn't know what was going on at first, and then I realized that this small child was flying through the air, carrying me along with her. We flew over the streets of the city, faster and faster, so fast that the city streets and buildings beneath us began to become a blur, and then they disappeared. As we moved by them, the streets were vanishing, and the buildings shrank, floor by floor, shrinking down to their foundation and then vanishing into nothing. It was as if we were traveling back in time, and the city was shrinking back to a younger age. Suddenly, we stopped in the air. There, we hovered over top of a large building beside a lake, a building nestled beside a forest on the edge of the city. Then, slowly, we descended from the air. As we got closer and closer to the ground, I started to recognize where we were.
Do you recognize this place, Mr. Scrooge?
The ghost asked. Yes, this is where I went to school. This is St. August's Catholic school. It used to sit outside of the city before it was condemned and demolished. I answered, realizing that we had indeed traveled backwards in time. This place no longer existed. I thought that maybe I was dreaming, but everything felt far too real to be a dream. I pinched myself, hoping that it was just a terrible nightmare that I could wake myself up from. It hurt. I didn't wake up. This was really happening. I slowly walked up to the building and peered inside the window. The school was just as I remembered it. Mr. Jacob's classroom, where I spent most of my time, was just as I remembered it. I peered around the room, and then I seen him. Well, me. I seen myself. I was a younger man in my early teens, and there I was, doing schoolwork ahead of time, as I frequently did in my school years. Then I seen movement at the door of the classroom, and in came a girl, a beautiful, curly-haired, blonde girl. She had piercing blue eyes, and she wore the blue girls' uniform of our school.
"Hi, Eddie,"
she said to a younger me. "Hey, Belle," my younger self replied. I then realized who this girl was. It was Belle, my girlfriend at the time. I'd almost forgotten how beautiful she was.
"Hey, White Christmas is playing over at the Wallace Theater. And, well, I was wondering, would you like to go with me to see it?"
she asked younger Eddie. "Sorry, Belle. I have work to do. Maybe another time?" he answered. At that time, I was working hard in school to impress Mr. Marley, and I was also working after school at Red Mart, which had just opened a few years prior. I had worked my way up from bag boy to manager pretty quickly, and I didn't want to slack off and become distracted from my work.
"Oh, okay,"
she said.
"Well, how about tomorrow?"
She asked again. "Belle, I have to work. You know that. I have to work and earn money to take you out to these places. I'm sorry," Eddie answered.
"Oh, okay.
She said, sounding disappointed.
Bye, Eddie,"
she said, before walking out of the room. I watched her walk through the school and then outside. She was sobbing, her tears nearly freezing in the below-zero temperature. I then remembered what happened next. She broke up with me that day. I was too busy for her, and she left me. "Wait! Stop!" I yelled. "I'm sorry! I'm so sorry, Belle!" I continued.
She can't hear you, Mr. Scrooge.
The spirit informed me. "Please, show me no more," I said.
Do you see Mr. Scrooge?
The ghost asked me. "See what?" I asked. "Why did you show me this? Why have you brought me here?" I continued.
You know why, Mr. Scrooge. You have to stop yourself from becoming like Mr. Marley.
The child answered. "Marley," I whispered. "Please, take me home, spirit. Please show me no more," I said.
Take my hand, Mr. Scrooge.
The spirit spoke. I did as the spirit asked, and took her hand, expecting to fly and return to my bedroom. I stared at the ground, expecting to lift upward off the ground and fly away. But that didn't happen. Instead, I felt the child's grip getting tighter and tighter on my hand. "What are you doing?" I asked as I looked up at the child. I then watched as something horrifying unfolded. The child's cute and innocent face began to rot away, peeling and decaying in disgusting, bloody masses that fell from her face. I began to scream in terror as her eyes popped out of her head and her face seemed to melt away like the scene from The Last Crusade. Beneath her skin was not a skull, however. Instead, it was the eyeless face of a porcelain doll. My screaming was silenced when the doll-faced child spoke.
When the clock strikes 2, expect the second ghost,
she said. I then blinked and woke up screaming in my bed. I looked around and my screaming slowly stopped as I realized where I was. I was home safe in my room. Was it a dream? It must have been. I must have been having a nightmare. I settled back in my bed, my heart still pounding 1,000,000 times an hour. I decided that I wasn't going to go back to sleep. I couldn't if I wanted to anyway. I was too terrified by the nightmare I had just experienced and didn't want to have another one. I just laid there in bed, waiting for the clock to strike 2. Waiting to see if it was all just a nightmare. It seemed like hours had passed by as I laid there in bed. The room was completely dark now. The neighbors had finally turned off their dreadful lights and gone to bed. I was starting to drift off again when I heard it. The grandfather clock in my hallway letting out 2 deep rings. It was 2 in the morning. It was at that time that I seen a bright light shine in from between my curtains. "Damn neighbors!" I exclaimed as I sat up and got out of bed to close my curtains to help dull the light from the neighbors' Christmas lights. But when I got out of bed, I realized that the light was not coming from outside my bedroom window, but from under my bedroom door. Slowly, I walked toward my door and reached for the handle. I opened it and found that my familiar hallway was not on the other side. Instead, it was a big room that was lit by torches that hung on pillars around the room. At the opposite end of the room were stacked towers upon towers of wrapped Christmas gifts and large bowls of candy and cookies. In the center of the room was a large wooden desk. Behind the large desk stood a man. He had a red cap with white, fluffy trim and a white ball of fluff at the end. He also wore a large red suit around his thick body, also trimmed of white fluff around its neck and waist. The man's lower half was hidden behind the desk. Could it be? I asked myself. Santa Claus? I asked the man behind the desk. A laugh came from the man. The laugh grew more maniacal. "You wish, Scroogey boy," a deep voice said in a very slight New England accent. Who are you?" I asked. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," the spirit said, before turning around and revealing his true form. It was not Santa, not at all. Instead of a jolly, fat, bearded man, I seen something much more grotesque. It was 3 large lumps of flesh consisting of all types of meat, beef, chicken, and human flesh. All 3 stacked on top of one another, a large ball of bloody meat at the bottom, a smaller one in the middle, and an even smaller one on top. Within the ball on top were carved 2 menacing eyes that burned with a fire within them. His mouth was filled with rows of teeth that consisted of the teeth of many animals whose flesh made up his body, and it was all topped off with a long, orange, carrot nose. This spirit appeared disgusting with its various forms of bloody and rotten meats, and he smelled as bad as he looked. "I have something to show you," Fleshy the Snowman told me. I didn't know what to say. There was a snowman made of flesh standing in front of me. What could I say? "Take my hand," the spirit told me, holding out a long, thin arm made of bones that were tied together with little strings of sinew and Christmas ribbons. Without speaking a word, I reached out and took the cold, bony hand of the flesh man. I was expecting to fly away, just as the ghost of Christmas past had done, but instead, the spirit walked back toward the door from which I had come in. My bedroom is what should have been on the other side of the door, but instead of my comfy room, the door opened to a cold city street. This was the bad side of town, and we were in the projects. I looked around, seeing the garbage and broken bottles scattered across the street, used syringes laid by the storm drains at the side of the road. This place was not fit for savages, much less a civilized man. "Why do you bring me here?" I asked him. "Look there," he said, in his slight accent, pointing his long, bony finger at the window that opened up into a basement apartment. So I trudged through the thick snow and peered down into the window. Inside, I seen a family of 5 A family of 5, 2 parents and 3 children, all sat, huddled around a kerosene heater. Behind the family was a small Charlie Brown Christmas tree with mostly dead branches that stood in the corner of the room. The 5 of them were opening their Christmas presents. They each had one gift. It was at that time that I noticed who the man of the house was. It was my employee, Bob Cratchit. I watched as the family opened their gifts. First, the youngest daughter opened her gift. It was an old, cheap-looking doll. It was probably bought from the dollar store over on 5th, but the child seemed grateful. Followed by Mrs. Cratchit. Her gift was a box of chocolates, which were also probably bought at the dollar store. The eldest daughter opened her gift next. It was a bag of socks. She looked a bit disappointed, but gratefully thanked her parents anyway. Bob was next. He opened his gift. It was a box of donuts. Donuts for Christmas? What a cheap gift, I thought to myself. Then I watched the youngest child open his present. He ripped the newspaper wrapping off of the gift to uncover the gift within. It was a bag of jelly beans. The poor kid got food for Christmas. "Why don't you get your kids more than that, Mr. Cratchit?" I asked him. "They can't hear you, Mr. Scrooge," Fleshy, the Snowman, informed me. "What kind of gifts are those?" I asked the ghost. "The kind of gifts that he can afford," the spirit replied. "You laid them off right before Christmas. What kind of guy does that?" The ghost added. "He must be wasting his money on drugs or something," I said. "I should have fired that addict a long time ago," I continued. "He does spend all his money on drugs," the spirit said. "Ha! I knew it!" I said. "Drugs to keep Tim alive," the spirit said. What do you mean?" I asked. "Look again," the flesh man said. I peered again down into the window to see the small child climbing up out of his seat by the heater. He had crutches that wrapped around his arms, and he could barely walk. He got along fairly well for his condition, and then he stopped for a moment and held his hand up to his mouth. He had a coughing fit for a few moments, nearly knocking him off balance.
"Are you okay, honey?"
the mother asked.
Yeah, Mom, I'm alright.
Tiny Tim said, after clearing his throat. "What's wrong with him?" I asked my guide. "He's sick. His dad can't afford his medicine, and without it, well," the spirit told me. "Well, what?" I asked, concerned. The spirit just looked at me with his burning eyes. "What? What will happen?" I asked. "Watch," the ghost told me again. Inside, I watched as children played. Then I watched as little Tim left the group and went up to his father.
Thank you, Daddy.
He said to his father.
"You're welcome, son."
Bob said to his son.
"I'm sorry I couldn't give you more."
He said, tears almost welling up in his eyes.
It's okay, Daddy. I know you don't have much, and you didn't have to get me anything.
Tim said to his father. Bob then grabbed his son and held him close.
"You're worth it, buddy. Merry Christmas, Timmy,"
he said, hugging his son close to him. I watched them, almost having a tear come to my eye. They had so little, but in their hearts, they had so much. "Oh," the ghost said, causing me to look up at him. "It just warms your heart, doesn't it?" Fleshy, the Snowman, said as he gripped the end of a bone sticking out of his chest and swung open a flesh-covered door within his chest. Inside of his chest beat a large, red, bleeding heart. as fire raged around it, scorching it and burning it. "Expect the third ghost at 3 o'clock," Fleshy the Snowman said, still holding his burning chest open. Again I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. And again I blinked and found myself sitting back in my bed. "What's happening to me?" I asked myself. "Am I losing my mind in my old age?" I asked further, sitting back against my pillow and staring at the ceiling. I was shocked, amazed, and terrified, all at the same time. This was really happening. I was really being visited by horrifying specters, grotesque things from another realm. I had been visited by 3 ghosts. My friend John Marley appeared to me first, chains being dragged far behind him. Next was the ghost of Christmas past, a creepy child who made twitching motions as she moved, only to reveal that beneath her skin there was a porcelain doll with eyes hollow as night. Then there was the ghost of Christmas present. I call him Fleshy the Snowman. He was 3 balls of flesh of various types, all molded together to form the shape of a snowman, all topped off with a carrot nose. Both within his eyes and within a hole in his chest burned a blazing fire. The next ghost was to come at the strike of 3, and 3 o'clock was only minutes away. I sat there in bed, afraid of what was to come. What wretched thing would come next? What spirit would haunt me? Then it happened. The grandfather clock in my hallway struck once, twice, 3 times. It was 3 in the morning. I sat there in my bed and waited, and nothing happened. Not at first, anyway. Then I was startled by a bright flash from outside that was quickly followed by a loud crack of thunder. It was a lightning strike that had struck very close by. I climbed out of bed as another strike of lightning flashed through my window. The window burst open, letting in the elements. Wind and freezing rain blew through my window as the doors of the window flapped in the wind. Quickly, I ran to my window to close it and latch it shut, but as I reached the window and looked out, I seen a figure standing on a hill near my home. It stood on a hill, silhouetted by the full moon behind it. A dark figure stood there, unmoving. Then suddenly, the lightning flashed again, and the figure was gone. I looked all around, but I could not find it. There was no way anyone could have run into the woods in a flash of lightning. Then, the lightning flashed again, and the figure suddenly reappeared, only closer this time, standing there, unmoving, menacing. The lightning flashed again, and again he was gone. The lightning struck again, and this time he was closer to my house, and there he was, appearing within the lightning strike. He was now just below my bedroom window. There he stood, freakishly tall, dark, hooded, standing there, looking up at me from the ground, his face shrouded by darkness beneath his hood. The lightning flashed again, striking again in the exact same place, and again the figure was gone. Then again the lightning flashed, but this time I didn't see the dark figure at all. I felt a large, freezing cold hand then come to rest upon my shoulder. I quickly turned around and almost died from fright at what I saw. There in my bedroom stood a 7-foot-tall, thin man in a black, hooded robe. His hood covered his face still, and I could not see his face. "Why do you ghosts continue to haunt me?" I asked him. But he said nothing. "Who are you?" I asked. Still, no reply. The specter just stood there, towering over me. The tall figure then pointed at the door, and his robe no longer covered his hand. His hand had rotting flesh hanging from it, with long, bony fingers poking out from beneath the skin and pointing to my bedroom door. I took the hint and slowly approached my bedroom door and opened it. The door didn't open up to my hallway. Instead, it opened up to yet another new area. The door led to an area that was outside, but it was no longer nighttime. It looked more like evening. The sun appeared to be setting as I stepped through the arch of my door. I peered around and realized that we were in a large cemetery. I stopped and gazed around and was suddenly pushed by the tall spirit. "What?" I asked. "Why are we here?" I continued. The tall spirit only pointed up to the top of the hill. There stood a family of 4, a mother, a father, and 2 daughters. The ghost and I walked up the hill toward the family, and I began to realize who it was that I was looking at. It was Bob Cratchit and his family, but someone was missing. Where's Tiny Tim?" I asked. "Where's Mr. Cratchit's son?" I asked further. The specter then pointed his rotten, bony finger toward the tombstone that the family gathered by. "No," I said. "He didn't," I continued, slowly backing up away from the family. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't know. I'm sorry," I continued, slowly backing away from the grave of Tiny Tim. I backed up to an edge and nearly fell into an open grave, but instead of falling into the pit, I stumbled forward and fell to my knees. There it was that I again seen the tall spirit standing beside the tombstone of the open grave. I watched as the rotten finger pointed at the headstone of the open grave. "Whose grave is this?" I asked him. He said nothing, still pointed at the grave. Lightning flashed again, and suddenly it was night outside. There was darkness all around. The only light in the cemetery was the occasional lightning flashes. It was when the lightning flashed that I seen the true visage of the final spirit. His face was a rotten mass of flesh and maggots clinging to a bloody skull that hid in the darkness beneath the hood. The look of the third ghost was both frightening and disgusting, but what I seen in the next flash of lightning disturbed me even further. Upon the headstone where the specter was pointing was a name. Edward Scrooge. My name. This was my grave, and the spirit was the ghost of Christmas future. "Is this my grave?" I asked. The spirit nodded. "No," I said. "No!" I continued, yelling at the twisted ghost. Then I felt 100 hands about my body. I looked around me and seen the shadows themselves come alive. The darkness itself formed into hands and began pulling me backward toward the open grave. "No!" I screamed. "No! Please stop!" I yelled again. The hands pulled me further backwards as I clawed against the ground, gripping at the grass and at tree roots to try and stop from being pulled into the depths of the grave. I felt my feet go over the edge of the grave, and I knew I couldn't hold on. I watched the outline of the spirit get further and further away from me. Then suddenly, I was pulled down into the pit. "No! Stop!" I screamed as I was pulled down into the grave. Down through the dirt I went, and I was pulled into the depths of hell. I was pulled into the burning pit of the abyss, where I seen and heard the torture of endless souls. I felt my chest grow tight, and I felt as if I were going to have a heart attack. I was terrified. I felt as if I were dying, or as if I was already dead, and I was being damned to my fate. Damned to spend eternity in hell for my greed. I gasped for air. I couldn't breathe. My chest grew tighter, and everything began to blur around me. And then suddenly, I blacked out. When I awoke, I found myself laying on the floor of my store. I was gripping the shirt over my chest tightly, so tightly that my fingers had turned white. What happened? I asked myself, looking around, confused. I gazed around my dark and empty store. Everyone had gone home and I was there alone. Vegetables and meats. I saw the aisles at the edge of the store. Unsold Halloween decorations, still on discount. And I saw the picture of Marley I had hung over the doorway to my office all those years ago. I remembered the spirits in all of their horror. But despite how monstrous they were trying to help me. I took one last look around my store and then made a decision. I gathered up a few things from the store and loaded up my Humvee, and off I went to pay someone a visit. The roads were icy, and it was early in the morning. The sun was starting to rise. I flipped on my radio and caught the ending of Jingle Bell Rock. When the song was over, a voice came on the radio. "Hey there, that was Jingle Bell Rock, and hey boys and girls, have fun with your Christmas gifts. Good morning and Merry Christmas." The voice on the radio spoke. "It's Christmas Day? I didn't miss it!" I exclaimed with joy. I arrived at my destination, the projects on the bad side of town. Sure, I had a nice car in a bad neighborhood, but I didn't care. If someone stole it, they needed it more than I did. I gathered up the bags of stuff that I brought from my store and made my way down the stairs and to the door. I sat the things down and knocked on the door.
Mr. Scrooge?
Bob said, surprised as he opened the door. "Mr. Cratchit," I said, looking at him sternly.
Why are you here?
He asked, confused and angry. "I understand that you're still sore about my actions," I said, "and rightfully so." I continued.
You're darn right,
he said, substituting the actual words he wanted to say because he was in the company of his children. "So I've decided that I was wrong to have done that, so I'd like to hire you back, and better yet, I want to give you a manager's position at Red Mart. You'll get a substantial raise, and the company will provide health insurance for you and your family. And, I began.
Mr. Scrooge?
Mr. Cratchit asked, obviously in shock over what he had just heard, and making sure that he was really speaking to me. "And I've brought some gifts for you and your family," I finished, holding out the bags for him.
Is this for real?
He asked me, completely amazed at what I had done. "Yes, sir, it is," I said.
Please come in, Mr. Scrooge.
He invited me in before introducing me to his family and closing the door behind me. Mrs. Cratchit looked at me, nearly in tears. I could tell she was happy.
"God bless you, Mr. Scrooge,"
she said, before a little voice spoke up from the back of the room.
"God blesses everyone,"
said Tiny Tim.
Well, that tale was surely a Christmas treat. It's so easy to fill up on good horror around the holidays. But if you're still famished, you'll definitely want to stop by next weekend for a gory tale all fleshed out in that Christmas style. So until then, my Christmas corpses, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.